There are currently dozens of COVID-19 vaccines in clinical trial. We'll tell you where they all stand and how close we are to one that will be made widely available.
And Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died Friday night at the age of 87 after complications from her battle with pancreatic cancer. We'll break down what it all means for the future of the Supreme Court with just 43 days to Election Day.
And the continuing economic impact the pandemic is having on Americans across the country. That and more right now on Talking Points. In the wake of Justice Ginsburg's passing and the vacancy on the Supreme Court, Senate Republicans have begun to whip votes for replacement. I'm Michael Furnari.
And I'm Manny Martinez. We do not yet know who Republicans have settled on, but President Trump has said that a replacement will be announced by the end of the week.
And the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is moving the nation's highest court front and center in the political landscape. With fewer than 50 days until the presidential election, President Trump and the Republicans are looking to fill the seat with a conservative justice, while Democrats are claiming hypocrisy after Republicans refused to hold hearings for Merrick Garland in 2016. Here to break down the political ramifications of Ginsburg's death is Talking Points analyst Anthony DeBundo. Anthony, who are the front-runners for President Trump to nominate here?
So it's been a pretty remarkably quick turnaround. By the end of the week, President Trump is expected to name his Supreme Court nominee, and there's two frontrunners that have clearly emerged at this point, with Amy Coney Barrett being the clear frontrunner. Trump said back when he nominated Brett Kavanaugh that he was expecting to save Coney Barrett for Ginsburg's seat if she were to have vacated it, which she has. And if it's not Coney Barrett, it's most likely going to be Barbara Lagoa. She is a Cuban-American from Florida. The name is expected to come out within the next day or two. So with the announcement coming up on Friday, realistically, the Senate could begin hearings just in a few weeks.
So, Anthony, I want to get a little bit more into that. What exactly is the process here for holding these hearings and a vote? When can we expect that, and what are we looking at as far as this tally?
Well, right now we've had a few senators start to weigh in, but when we look at the entire process, it typically takes about 2 months for a Supreme Court justice to be both confirmed and seated on the court. But what we've seen so far is that Lindsey Graham has kind of led the way here in the Senate. He had quite a few things to say back in 2016, of course, when Merrick Garland was nominated by President Obama.
Of a lame duck president, and if Ted Cruz or Donald Trump get to be president, they've all asked us not to confirm or take up a selection by President Obama. So if a vacancy occurs in their last year of their first term, guess what? You will use their words against them.
Graham said in 2016, now kind of reversing course, saying that he's going to vote for President Trump's nominee. So we're getting closer to a name and closer to a process here before the election.
Anthony, how are key senators up for re-election weighing in on potential confirmation hearings?
Well, it's really a fascinating political decision here. The number one name that everybody has been talking about is Susan Collins. She is a Republican senator from Maine. She is facing a very tough re-election campaign. And quite frankly, she had this to say about about the passing of Ginsburg and then the ultimate decision on whether or not to vote. She has not been particularly in favor of it. She said that she did not want to see the Senate come up and have a vote before the election. She wanted the next president, whether it be President Trump or Joe Biden, who's nominated, whoever that would be, that's who she wanted to say. She said, given the proximity of the presidential election, she does not believe the Senate should vote on the nominee prior to the election. Now, Martha McSally, she's also a vulnerable Republican senator from Arizona. She had a different tune. She said this U.S. Senate should vote on President Trump's next nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court. Obviously, two very different tones and two very different stances. But one interesting thing is that even though Collins said she was against having the proceedings, she did not say that she would not vote for whoever the nominee was.
And what is public sentiment in polling about Republicans filling the seat before the election?
So the polling falls pretty much along partisan lines, but it's clear that one big difference between 2016 and 2020 is that Democrats are much more motivated by the courts. Of course, in 2016, Antonin Scalia died in June. That made the filling the Supreme Court seat of utmost importance to the Republicans, as Scalia was much more conservative. Now it's clear the Democrats are fired up. 52% of Biden supporters said that the court is a much higher issue now since Ginsburg's passing than they said that before. So it's a key issue, and it's really energizing Democrats to get out to vote. We'll see how it affects those vulnerable GOP senators that are up for re-election.
Thanks, Anthony. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been speculation about when a vaccine would be ready. And months later, there is still no vaccine available to the public, but some companies and institutions are making headway with research and development. Here with more details about possible COVID-19 vaccinations is Talking Points analyst Natalie Fani. Natalie.
Thanks, Manny. Right now, researchers are testing a total of 40 vaccines in clinical trials on humans, and at least 92 vaccines are being investigated on animals. For a vaccine to be approved for mass distribution, it must pass through 5 phases first. Currently, there are 27 vaccines in phase 1, meaning they are being tested for safety and dosage. 15 in phase 2, which consists of expanding safety trials, and 9 in phase 3, which is where vaccines go to large-scale efficacy tests. But the 2 phases to focus on are the limited phase and approved phase. At the moment, there are 5 vaccines in the limited phase, authorizing them for early and specific use, but none in the approved phase, which gives a full green light for full use. Last week, Moderna, currently in phase 3 with their trial, said it was on track to produce 20 million doses of its experimental coronavirus vaccine by the end of the year, and they are getting ready to have 500 million doses by 2021. Moderna plans to seek emergency authorization if its vaccine is at least 70% effective in high-risk groups. The company has a deal with the United States for 100 million doses once they are approved. Also on the horizon with possible vaccines are Pfizer and AstraZeneca. Both companies are testing in large groups of about 30,000 subjects, and after 2 AstraZeneca subjects fell ill from the trials, the company released their plan saying that its goal is a vaccine with 50% effectiveness. The CDC anticipates 35 to 45 million doses of vaccines from the first 2 companies to reach the final phase available in the United States by the end of the year. And President Trump says as soon as a vaccine is approved, the American people will have access and it will be distributed within 24 hours after notice.
Doses will be available every month, and we expect to have enough vaccines for every American by April. Hundreds of millions of doses will be available every month, and we expect to have enough vaccines for every American by April.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Certainly something we're going to be keeping an eye on. And President Trump's latest executive order took effect this week, aiming to combat the cost of prescription drug prices. In a following statement issued by the White House, the Trump administration is pledging to cut prices of upwards of 50% in some areas. Critics, however, express skepticism. Talking Points analyst Augustus LaRue joins us now to walk us through the latest. Gus, what do you have?
Thanks, Mike. This executive order comes as the latest in a months-long campaign the administration has been running against Big Pharma. The order, specifically targeting Medicare, establishes a price limit on Part B and D prescription medications, forcing pharmaceutical companies to either lower their costs or lose business. The question left in many minds is, why is Trump, a Republican, advocating for price fixing? The president heavily related this decision to his general policy of America First, citing the fact that many Americans often pay far more than other nations for the same prescription drugs. And he's right. A 2019 study by the House Ways and Means Committee showed that those Americans on average paid 4 times as much, that upwards of $49 billion could be saved if American prices were to match. It is important to remember, though, that we are talking about an executive order, not an act of Congress, and that can leave things a little murky. While the president has obviously established a basis for future regulation, that's ultimately all the executive order is. As of right now, there is no timetable for when the president's executive order will have its intended effect.
Now, Gus, you said there's actually no regulation attached to this executive order. So how is this different from just any other statement?
Well, it's almost comparable to a House resolution, but within the executive branch. What this executive order is intended to do is to basically set a directive to the executive branch. So through the executive, you have organizations, specifically Health and Human Services and the State Department, that can further issue directives and regulations that will effectively reach the intended goal of this executive order.
So, Gus, this isn't really your typical Republican policy. How are lawmakers on Capitol Hill reacting?
You know, we're seeing a lot of mixed reactions. Chuck Grassley was one of the first to issue a statement actually coming out in support of this executive order, saying that he believed it was high time that prices on prescription drugs were lowered, but we are seeing many negative reactions. Of course, Joel White, in particular, Republican strategist, was very vocal about his criticisms of this plan, believing it to be a staunch break from what is considered typical Republican policy.
So, Gus, you know, prescription drugs is a really important issue, particularly in the Midwest. How do you think this is going to impact the election, if at all, especially in those Midwestern states?
Well, I think that this is actually intended to help Trump's base somewhat. Obviously, this executive order, and if it has its intended effects, or at the very least the promise, is mainly targeted at middle America and more senior citizens of the United States. Regardless of whether or not we actually see its intended effect before the election, it could potentially help turn some voters to Trump this election.
Thanks, Gus.
And coming up next, we're in the final days of the presidential race. We'll break down the town halls of both Biden and President Trump.
And Israel has reached agreements with 2 Arab countries. What this means for the Middle East, coming up next.
Properly extinguished can cause a wildfire. It looks as if Smokey is going to use the drown, stir, drown and feel technique. After the first drown, a good start. Next, another drink. And finally, a close feel.
Is it cool? Okay. Yeah. Hey, Smokey, catch. Oh, my bad, Smokey.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
With just 8 days until the first presidential debate of 2020, candidates Donald Trump and Joe Biden had held town halls in Pennsylvania last week. Both candidates answered questions about handling the COVID-19 pandemic, ongoing protests throughout the country, as well as health care plans. One of the main topics President Trump at his town hall was his handling of the pandemic and his response to COVID-19. So how did he react to these questions, Mariah?
So one of the first things that Trump answered at his town hall was about his admission to journalist Bob Woodward about downplaying the pandemic. And he answered this by saying he actually upplayed it in terms of action. He also said with this that with the coronavirus, he thinks his administration has handled it fairly well thus far.
So how did Biden say he would handle the pandemic?
So Biden was a little bit different with handling the pandemic. First, he said that he would make governors in each state make sure that they mandated masks or have them do it as soon as possible, as well as pay healthcare workers more. He thinks that the Trump administration did not actually handle the coronavirus well at all since March to this point.
And going back to President Trump before we finish, what did he say in reaction to the protests that are happening around the country that we've seen all summer?
Now, given the recent protests, President Trump said while the events were tragic, he believes that people should be focusing on being respectful to police, and he also said that while the events were tragic, he respects the law enforcement and thanks them for endorsing him with his campaign.
Thank you very much, Mariah. So this past week, Israel signed the new peace deal with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain at the White House, normalizing relations with the two countries. This marks the third such deal between Israel and countries in the Arab world with the goal of normalization, with the last one coming in 1994 with Jordan. Talking Points analyst Oscar Offerman is here to explain what this means for the Middle East.
Tell me when to go. This all started back in May when Belarusian YouTuber and politician Sergei Tikhanovsky was arrested and accused of being a foreign agent. Soon after, the protests against Belarus's president, Alexander Lukashenko, began. After her husband's arrest, Sergei Tikhanovsky's wife, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, then decided to run for the presidency in Belarus. On August 9th, the elections took place. On that day, all roads into Belarus's capital, Minsk, were blocked by police, and Belarus's internet was also partially blocked. Belarus's state-run media reported that President Lukashenko received around 80% of the vote, with the opposition receiving only 10%. Many in Belarus, including those who were pro-government, believed that the election results were falsified. That night, protests in Minsk turned violent, with about 3,000 being arrested, at least 50 hospitalized, and 1 dead. According to the BBC, opposition leader Tikhanovskaya was forced to flee Belarus to Lithuania. Fast forward to the beginning of September, and major members of the opposition were abducted and detained over a 2-day period. President Lukashenko has recently announced that Belarus will close its borders with Poland and Lithuania and step up measures with Ukraine, although nothing has come of this yet.
So, Spencer, you're talking about Belarus right now. So, what has been the reaction? So, can you give me just a kind of an overview of the events that have been going on in this country? There have been protests really for the past month. What are we looking at right now?
Position in red. Belarus is in yellow. Now, some of the key players in support of Lukashenko are China and Russia. Chinese President Xi Jinping was one of the first to congratulate Lukashenko. China has strategic interests in Belarus with a lot of money invested through China's Belt and Road Initiative and Huawei's 5G plan. Now, some key supporters in support of the opposition are the United States and the European Union. The United States and the European Union, The EU will impose sanctions on individuals in Belarus and divert 53 million euros towards victims of the protests and the coronavirus. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has urged Belarus to engage the Opposition Coordination Council and protester demands.
So, Spencer, what can you tell us about the international community's response to what's been going on in Belarus? All right, some technical difficulties on Spencer's end, all the way over there in California. Now we're going to be hearing from Oscar Offerman about the peace deals between Israel, Bahrain, and other countries in the Middle East. Oscar, what can you tell us?
Thanks, Michael. Now, this deal between Israel and two Gulf state countries completely upends the conventional wisdom regarding foreign policy in the region for both Israel and the United States. Now, in the previous two deals, in 1979 with Egypt and in 1994 with Jordan, peace involved concessions made by the Israelis, whether it be land or provisions regarding Jerusalem and the Palestinians. In this new deal, there are no such concessions regarding Israel, thereby shifting the narrative for peace in the area. Whereas before it seemed as if peace was only possible until the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was resolved, now it seems like a problem to be solved later. Now, a major factor in this peace breakthrough is because of the precarious position of both Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. Both of these countries are sandwiched between two feuding regional powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, the UAE and Bahrain are allied with the Saudis, who dominate the Gulf region, so you can expect that a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia is in the works.
Thank you very much. And coming up next, how the pandemic may have lasting effects on the state of the American economy.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
They call me Maxie, but I prefer tripod. I was your above-average four-legged homie, and then wham, bam, minivan. Some people pity me. Now that's lame. I still run, fetch, and swim. And the ladies love me. I'm the ultimate wingman. Just don't ask me to high five.
They'll test you. Try to break your will. But however loud the loudness gets, however many cheese puffs may fly. You're the driver, the one in control. Stand firm. Just wait. And move only when you hear the click that says they're buckled in for the drive. Never give up till they buckle up.
And welcome back to Talking Points. Manny Martinez, Michael Furnari. And coming off its worst quarter ever in terms of GDP contraction as a result of the pandemic, the American economy is showing some signs of recovery, this quarter, which ends in just 9 days. But the recovery process might hit a few bumps in the road in the near future. Around the country, big corporations like airlines, small businesses, and everyday folks are still reeling, looking for any and all the help they can get. Airline executives met with White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows last week to ask for more cash, explaining that without it, tens of thousands of jobs will be in jeopardy come October 1st. Airlines already got $25 billion in the spring, but are looking for more to avoid dipping into government loans to stay afloat while travel slowly ticks back up. The main stipulation of the first cash grant airlines received was no layoffs nor furloughs through the end of September under any circumstances. The Paycheck Protection Program, created this year to assist small businesses to overcome COVID-19 setbacks, has been closed to new applicants since August 8th. There's still $138 billion worth in unused funding in the program, but congressional gridlock currently has the money in a standstill. The PPP loan is a one-time cash payment designed to keep small businesses open and fully staffed for up to 24 weeks, and it's credited with saving as many as 51 million American jobs. And it was a big focus of the $2.2 trillion CARES Act relief package from March. And in the home, Americans are feeling these burdens, and an NPR report actually exemplifies the extent of the struggle, with at least half of all households in the country's 4 largest cities experiencing deep financial uncertainty, whether it's depleted savings, a hard time paying bills, or being unable to afford medical care. So Michael, the bottom line is that Americans need help to get by, and you actually have more on a group that did receive help from the government.
That's right, Manny. So one of the very crucial things that's going on right now is that President Trump has actually sponsored a bailout, so to speak, for farmers. There's going to be roughly $15 billion being sent to farmers over these next few months here. Now, there have been $30 billion for farmers so far this year. The farming business is something that requires a lot of subsidies. Every year, even when there's no pandemic, the agricultural business relies heavily on subsidies from the federal government in order to maintain business. Now, with COVID-19, that's really impacted them. Double the aid going to farmers this year than it normally does. They are going to need that money if they're going to stay afloat over these next few months. Now, there's a lot of other things going on in the country economically, and we've got big news out of the Federal Reserve over the last week. So the Federal Reserve announced that they are going to be keeping interest rates near zero for the next few years. That's massive news. How that affects people is that means that it's going to be much easier to take out loans. That means when people are starting businesses, trying to keep their businesses afloat, it's going to be much easier for them to take out loans in order to keep those businesses going. Now, the flip side of this is that when you have low interest rates, what that leads to is inflation. The other thing that leads to inflation is government spending. Now, the government spending has been far bigger than you would normally expect in a year. So far, there's been a $2.5 trillion windfall between the budget and what the federal government is bringing in right now. That's a big problem. And Alan Greenspan, former Federal Reserve Chair, expressed some concerns about that earlier this week as well. So what we're looking at here is the Federal Reserve is trying to be very proactive in making sure that the economy going forward is going to be flush with cash and people are going to be able to get loans. The problem is that that's going to lead to inflation, and people who are saving their money right now may be impacted by that. Traditionally, for the last decade, inflation has been roughly at 2% or under, closer to 1%. It looks like those times may be over, and we're going to be entering into kind of a new fiscal period as we transition away from the 2008 financial crisis.
And Michael, President Trump, coming up after the break, President Trump has sent $13 billion in aid to Puerto Rico, and his opponent, Joe Biden, has also published his plan for helping the island recover from Hurricane Maria. That's next.
I see you mobbing over her. Let's go. Let's mob. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, we mobbing. Come on, girl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Boom.
Last week, former Vice President Joe Biden released a plan for aid to Puerto Rico. The plan calls for disaster relief loans to be forgiven and will ensure that all areas of the island have access to federal funding. On Friday, President Trump announced an additional $13 billion in aid for the island, with $10 billion going to repair a major electrical grid on the island. It is unclear if the timing of Trump's announcement has anything to do with Biden's. Talking Points analyst Oscar Offerman is back to discuss what this means for Puerto Rico and the presidential race. Oscar? So why is Biden releasing this plan now?
So he's releasing this plan now to appeal to voters in Central Florida. And we know this because after he released the plan, he went and visited people in Central Florida. Central Florida is the area where the most Puerto Ricans who fled the hurricane three years ago in Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria, they went to Central Florida. Biden was there. He made a speech talking about COVID-19 and also talking about the situation on the island and Trump's lack of funding up to that point. It took 3 years to get that funding.
So if this plan is to go into effect, the Joe Biden plan specifically, what would that look like on the ground for people in Puerto Rico, Oscar?
So Trump released an aid plan, Biden released an aid plan. They're very similar in tone. Trump's plan will have $10 billion allocated for fixing an electrical grid. The bottom line is Puerto Rico will get that aid and it will happen relatively soon.
And what's the willpower to get this done politically? Is the deal enough pressure?
So Congress actually allocated $43 billion for aid in Puerto Rico, I believe back in 2018. Now, the U.S. government has only used $26 billion of that money. So the money is there. It's the political impetus that might not be there.
So, Oscar, you mentioned Florida. I think that's a really interesting point. What does this kind of, what we're talking about here is, the ongoing effort in Hurricane Maria. This has been going on since 2017. Could what these two candidates are doing change the narrative on the ground at all in states like Florida?
It could. It's more than likely only going to change the plan in Florida.
Oscar, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. That's all the time, but we're going to be coming back to this issue at some point in the future. That's all the time we have for you tonight on Talking Points. I'm Michael Furnari.
And I'm Manny Martinez. See you next week.